Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Now, we all know the huge impact that expropriation of land without compensation is going to have on the South African economy, and not only that, the value of the rand, which is just going to go and tank. It's going to be worth diddly squat, just like Zimbabwe. That's the road to ruin that South Africa is on. And people in the property industry have recognized this. And I'll tell you why. South Africa's property companies, both listed and private, are taking billions offshore in the face of poor economic growth locally, spiraling municipal rates and taxes, political and policy uncertainty, and issues such as construction site invasions, and of course land grabs. Two statistics bear testimony to a surge of capital being invested offshore. Research by New York-based Real Capital Analytics indicates that South African headquartered property investors placed US dollars 4.9 billion, that's 68 billion rand, overseas in 2018. And Standard-listed property funds head Kylan Ndlovu says South Africa's listed property companies now have offshore exposure of 47% compared to barely any exposure outside the country just a decade ago. That's a huge turnaround. In its study published in June, Real Capital states the gulf between investment activity in South Africa and overseas spending by South African investors has never been greater. These players invested about 4 times as much internationally than was spent in their home market during 2018. So let's have a look at that chart first. Real Capital adds, on the back of weaker than expected domestic economic growth in the first quarter of 2019, it's likely that South African investors will continue to explore overseas exposure. International activity by South African investors overtook domestic investment in 2016, and since the gap between overseas and domestic spending has widened significantly. Domestic acquisition volume fell more than 50% between 2017 and 2018 as listed entities pulled out and became net sellers. According to the report, of the 4.9 billion US dollars invested offshore in 2018, over 60% was invested in retail. The balance was split nearly equally between office and industrial property. All the cross-border investment for the year took place in Europe, which 30% focused on Poland and 17% into the UK, it notes. Now, just on a point there, the reason why the South African government are still allowing people to move their money offshore to buy property is because guess who one of the major groups doing this are? The corrupt politicians. They're buying property in places like Dubai with their ill-gotten gains so that it cannot be touched by the South African government. And as I've said so many times, you watch, if Ramaphosa, the shit hits a fan, he'll be on the first plane out there with all his ill-gotten millions of dollars and settle overseas, and he'll be fine, thank you. And middle finger to anyone left behind who he was claiming to represent and who he never did. And this is what I think of Ramaphosa. You can pog my horn. Hippo eyes. Anyway, let's get back to this story. So listed entities were the top overseas buyers last year, with Redefined Properties, Vukile and Nepi Rockcastle topping the list. The largest deal was the purchase of a Spanish retail asset portfolio by Vukile Property Fund for 489 million euros from Unibel Rodamco. The acquisition of the Riverbank House office property in London for £390 million was the biggest single asset deal. Oxygen Asset Management purchased the property on behalf of South Africa's Zeno Capital, added the report. Now, I'm going to show you a chart which shows you exactly where this money has been invested overseas. Questioned by MoneyWeb, Ndlovu says SA Property Index, or SAPY, companies are heavily invested in Central and Eastern Europe, with almost 30% exposure. He says Stanlip's research shows that while the CEE market makes up the bulk of the 47% offshore exposure of SAPY companies, other offshore markets include 7% in Western Europe, countries like Spain and Germany, 8% in Australia, 2% in the UK, and 1% in the rest of Africa. Doesn't show a great deal of confidence in Africa, does it? Ndlovu notes that the sector's exposure to Western Europe increased after Vakili did well by spotting an opportunity in Spain. However, on the UK and the rest of Africa fronts, there seems to be reduced interest due to Brexit and poor liquidity in the rest of Africa, respectively. He said, barring Growthpoint Investec Africa's fund and Grit's expansion drive in the rest of Africa, most other South African real estate investment trusts, REITs, such as Hiprop and ATAC, were looking to exit. Despite investment in the US in the past year by local mid-cap REIT Emiria Property Fund, the exposure of South Africa's listed property sector to the US is marginally at below 1%. And Ndlovu believes South Africa's listed property sector's offshore exposure will top the 50% mark in the next year or two. It's hard to believe that the sector's offshore exposure has grown from virtually 0% just over 10 years ago to some 47% today. But for the first time in decades, listed property companies and funds are now delivering distribution or income growth below inflation. He adds distribution growth has slowed down to the 2 to 3% levels. This has been largely driven by weak economic growth as well as oversupply of properties, particularly in the office and retail space. Without diversifying exposure to offshore markets, distribution growth will be a negative 3% to 4%. Gareth Elston, Chief Investment Officer at Reitway Global, notes, the first movers who started to look abroad during the global financial crisis period, such as Growthpoint with GOZ, Growthpoint Properties Australia, and Resilient with NEPI, were very well rewarded for taking the risk of expanding into new markets during a turbulent economic time. Due to the realities in the South African economy, property investors have almost been forced to go abroad to look for growth opportunities. Commenting on the flight of listed property capital offshore, South African Property Owners Association CEO Neil Gopal says besides poor economic growth and policy uncertainty, a major factor is years of above-inflation hikes in municipal rates and taxes. And poor service delivery. Guess where all the money's going? Into the back pockets. And guess who's been charged and arrested for this? Nobody. Welcome to the reality of South Africa. No wonder they're all leaving. Anyway, Gopal went on to say, rates and taxes have been the second fastest growing operating cost item for property owners and investors since 2007. Adding to the sector's woes are construction site invasions, in addition to poor service delivery, the skills deficit, the brain drain, and building plan and rezoning delays at municipal level. We are not only seeing our members increasingly investing offshore, but international investors are also being put off from investing in South Africa, which is effectively a double whammy for our economy, says Gopal. Well, there you go. And property is one of the foundation stones of any sound economy. So it kind of spells out where South Africa is going. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed, ring the bell for updates, and have a great evening.